Hey guys, welcome back to Altaz-Review, where we talk about all the latest games. The latest hot topic has been Senua's Saga Hellblade II, a pretty mysterious sequel that's finally released 7 years after the original. The original game has been well respected as a beautifully creative and innovative game that's been the best depiction of mental illness and the journey towards overcoming it. It's also one of the more notable games in terms of motion capture technology and using facial expressions to convey emotion rather than purely relying on dialogue. But now with Senua's Saga, we're going to explore new depths of Senua's condition and how far she's come. We also get to see how far the developers have come when it comes to expanding such a niche game design. So let's get right into it. After just 1 week of releasing, Hellblade 2 has already become quite a controversial game, and there's been a lot of talk about what kind of problems fans have had with the game. So let's just go over the current state of these controversies before we start making our own analysis. For the many fans of Senua's Sacrifice, the first part, having a fairly short experience isn't particularly new. But in anticipation of this new modern-gen creative sequel, old and new players expected something a little longer than the previous game. And that's just from a gameplay perspective. Being too short is a much bigger offense when players have to pay almost $50 for a 7 to 8 hour game. In addition, many players claim that many of the mechanics are too similar to the first game, and that Hellblade 2 doesn't really add all that much new content, which is a pretty fair complaint. But we'll get more into that later. And some people weren't particularly invested in the new story, since it doesn't seem to have much of a direction. But that's just the basic controversies other people have had. Getting to the actual game itself, let's talk about first impressions and how the game compares to the first part. Right off the bat, the thing I'm most impressed by was the water. I really can't help it. I know a lot of games have some great water graphics, but the interaction with water and seeing the unique ripples as you walk through it really show you how far gaming has come. It's beautiful to see the perfect reflections in the water, and it's even more amazing to see how the reflections bend with the water waves. There's even small trickles of water that spread every time you splash the water, and the water splashes depending on how fast you run on the water. But while we're talking about the graphics, the hair motion is also one of the better movements in modern-gen gaming. We've seen a lot of good and bad hair sway. Looking at you, Forbidden West. But Senua's ponytail swishes around with perfect momentum no matter how she runs, twists, or turns. And the most impressive element of Senua's Saga is obviously the motion capture, which is definitely one of the strong points of the series. Hellblade 1 and 2 are heavily dependent on the motion capture, as they use facial expressions to convey emotions, and constantly use facial emotions even in dialogue instead of talking about the character's feelings or leaning on the voice acting. Most games can't use facial expressions too much since it overcomplicates things and it could actually make things look worse. But with modern motion capture technology and Ninja Theory's perfect direction and camera focus, Hellblade 1 and 2 look like live-action movies. And then there's the gameplay itself. Hellblade 2 is pretty similar to the first part, but that just means that everything from part 1 is perfectly preserved in Hellblade 2. The only differences being in new additions and story progression. For example, Senua still hears voices and uses these voices instead of having a HUD for the player. That means we still have no tutorial pop-ups and no indication of health, focus, side activities, or where to go. But the voices always tell you what you need to do. But in the first game, it was pretty clear that it's all just Senua's mental journey. So the voices just describe Senua's mental state. Now in Hellblade 2, Senua is roaming the real world while still dealing with the voices and her schizophrenic episodes. In the very first hour, we see how distracting this is. You hear strange noises of enemies, creatures, animals, or even dying people. It's confusing because you keep looking around thinking some enemy is near or there's some point of interest around you. The voices keep varying from telling you your next task, warning you of enemies, whether they're lying or not, or just contradicting themselves, telling you you're a failure and that you're strong enough at the same time. Even in combat, you're not sure which parts are real and what's just part of Senua's imagination. And it's never clear since no one even mentions it. It's not like anyone asked why she's spacing out, nor does anyone talk about the weird monsters they were fighting. Even more so because most of the characters in this part are pretty crazy themselves, or other people's metaphors are being interpreted literally by Senua. The player is just as mixed up as Senua is, and yes, there's real characters now. Naturally, Senua will meet several new people in her new adventure, and these people will have different personalities, goals, and mental stability. Some are surprised by Senua's habits, while others understand her fully. But the worst part of real characters is how perfectly the game captures the mental struggles of Senua. any conversation she has is plagued by the voices talking over Senua and the other characters, and they constantly comment or question whatever the conversation is about. You can barely hear what they're talking about, and that multitasking is exactly what people must struggle with when they have mental issues like Senua. It really puts you in Senua's shoes, and that's also why I'd recommend keeping subtitles off if you can. The voices are so contradictory, they might even make the wrong suggestions. At one point during a puzzle, the voices suggested I backtrack through the difficult cave I just came from to progress, saying maybe go back to the cave, no? And I might have tried it until I saw where to actually go. And then getting to the main gameplay, Hellblade 2 is more or less the same as Part 1, but with way better graphics. Part 1 looked amazing, so Part 2 looking so much better is very impressive. The controls are shown right before the first cutscene, and they're right in front of you in the pause menu. So keep checking it out, because even in the first few fights, the voices will simply tell you to hit harder, move out of the way, or focus, and you'll have to figure out the right button yourself. But the combat feels a little smoother in this game, mostly because of enemy types and the animations. I admit, it eventually gets repetitive, but being such a cinematic game, the fight scenes have a lot of weight in every movement, and each fight is over pretty quickly. Part 1 had some tough fights and bosses that got a little annoying later. Hellblade 2 doubles down on being a cinematic game and makes sure the visuals and scenarios are the main part of the game, with puzzles and fights being a bit easier to get through. The game has also left behind the horror aspect. Hellblade 1 was pretty much a horror game with good story, but Hellblade 2 has a lot of beautiful bright vistas and colorful moments. It's still got some horrific moments too, but it's not a complete horror game anymore. The game is now focused on art direction, story, music, and conveying a deeper message, since the story is now about growth rather than revenge or fear. And the new theme benefits greatly from the amazing graphics, as the sky, the water, and Senua's mental visuals all look breathtaking. Seeing how even the upgrade mechanics and gameplay can still get a little repetitive, the 7-hour playtime is still a smart decision. But naturally, people will be satisfied with such a short adventure, since the whole story sets itself up like it's gonna be a long journey. And I'll admit, without the amazing graphics, the game isn't really all that fun. The visuals and the graphics really do carry the game quite a bit. And on that note, let's comment on the story. Hellblade 2 is completely about story, so I don't want to explain too much. But Hellblade 2 has a very different tone from the first part. If you played Part 1, you know that Senua has had to come to terms with her own mental condition, and with her dark past, with all that's happened to her family and loved ones. You now get to see different perspectives from other characters, and you see how Senua gets to the real world while juggling the voices in her head with what she needs to do. As you play, the voices comment on how Senua feels about everything. And even though it's really annoying, all these voices are really just the kinds of things we think about in daily life during our own problems. Senua's voices are just louder, but it's still very relatable. We all keep mentally commenting on how difficult or scary something is, or we keep thinking whether someone is lying or about how someone else feels. Seeing Senua in this game really humanizes her and shows that she's not just crazy, she just has a louder mind. Just like us, her voices tell her not to open up, others won't understand, and the voices comfort you and harass you at the same time. But Senua's main struggle in this game is how she copes with the revelations from Part 1. Spoilers for Part 1, but what happened is that slavers came to her village and killed everyone while she was outside of the village. And she still blames herself, since everyone in the village said that her curse brought misery. Now Senua tries to save whomever she can, kind of out of guilt. She wants to help people, she wants to bring justice to whoever killed her village, and she wants to prove she's not just a curse on others. And no matter how irrational her fears and doubts are, only she can forgive herself. And that task is even harder when the voices in her head confuse her even more. It's a very different feeling when, at one point in the game, Senua's companions see strange things and noises and it just messes them up. But Senua is used to it. It's not easy, but she gets by without help. Instead, she needs to take care of her companions and help them get through the difficult moment. It really shows you just how strong Senua is to be able to live like that every day of her life. And that's a good message for everyone. Well, that's what I thought about this amazing new game. I think Hellblade 2 doesn't deserve the controversy. The price is definitely too high for such a short game, but it's still a high quality experience that pushes forward the story and feelings from the first game. But it really depends on who's playing. I've heard many others say the same, and I'll agree that if you enjoyed Part 1, play Part 2. If not, then think twice before getting the game. But let me know what you guys think about Hellblade 2 and what other games you'd like to hear about. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Until then, I hope I see you in the next video.